Hi, everyone. So happy to see so many new and familiar faces. Thank you for joining the Dark Forest Collective in this first of its kind ever conversation on the newly released Dark Forest Anthology of the Internet. It is both a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. Um, my name is Ruby Tillo. I'm an adjunct professor of design and media theory at NYU, also a designer and an artist. This topic has been with me for a little bit now, not as long as the other folks in this room, but I myself, as I've been thinking about this idea of these sort of niche communities that are sort of crawling and hiding all over the internet, and trying to find ways to bring some light to them. We are in the presence of amazing guests who have all, as you know, because you have bought the book, contributed to this wonderful tome. I'll do a brief introduction of their names. There's Yancey, Caroline and Little Internet, Joshua Citarella, Peter Limberg, Venkatesh, and am I forgetting anyone? Leith is also here, and Rebecca Fox. With that, I will leave it up to Yancey to do a quick introduction of the Dark Forest.
Thank you, Ruby. So the other day, I was speaking with the writer Nadia Asparova, who is here in the audience today, author of the great book, Working in Public, that Stripe Press put out. And in this conversation, Nadia mentioned the classic piece, Status as a Service by Eugene Wei, which details how Twitter functions or functioned as this giant status creating and seeking engine. And this piece, Nadia said in this conversation, represented the defining crystallization of the era of the internet when we were all optimizing for likes and cultural cachet. This was a novel and exciting game and something essentially all ambitious people felt compelled to do. Nadia also described the Dark Forest and the pieces the authors around this roundtable wrote as representing the next era of the internet, the one that we're in now, where instead of seeking to maximize status, which of course a lot of people, us included, maybe still do, more of us found ourselves seeking safety and context instead. Eugene's piece was published in February 2019. The first Dark Forest essay was published in May 2019. So what happened in those 3 months? But this is the nature of the internet and the nature of culture. The same moment someone is crowning something as having hit an apex, someone else is ready to move on. And that shift from one social order and the emergence of a new one with new rules, new physics, and even new goals is the topic that the Dark Forest theory gives voice to. Around this table are authors who have crystallized these ideas. Speaking personally, these are all people I've long read and respected, and it just so happened that all of us together, in trying to express our experiences and different viewpoints about the web, helped generate a cohesive thought as captured in the Dark Forest Anthology. Published over the course of 5 years, our experiences match this realization that we were moving away from what Eugene documented in Status as a Service and towards a new world of something more like status as a context, where the worlds where we could create status had rapidly expanded, but none were as big or as powerful as this massive status engine as before. And this is this confusing post-Babel time that we're in now. And so as I look at this, all of this 5 years after those first feelings and thoughts, what stands out now is something so obvious it feels almost not worth saying. But I think those of us in this room and who are part of Dark Forest have felt longer than most, which is that the internet is real life. What we do in here matters just as much as, and maybe problematically even more than, what happens out there. What happens in here matters. This is real life. The experiences we're having living life online matter, and they matter in even bigger ways. It's establishing something bigger than any of us. It's adding up to something. And it's still so early in this process that it's hard to tell where it's going, but it's not going to stop, and we continually underestimate them. What lays ahead is a future defined by the web. In recent years, we've gotten tied up in this infantile vision of the metaverse, this idea of life porting over onto screens based on this 20th century imagination of what computers would do. But what's actually happening is even more incredible. The internet is a mesaverse. It's concerned with what's within. It's where our alts come alive, where our internal monologues become dialogues, and where a straight thought becomes a globally resonant meme. The internet isn't supposed to give a graphical representation of our bodies. It's the thing that makes what's inside, our minds, our souls, ourselves, come alive. That's what the internet really does. And so this is why these ideas resonate. This is why they matter, because the internet is real, because dark forests are real, because they do exist and they will keep existing, because our dreams and fears and our desires will too. You'll never find your own dark forest. It doesn't exist. The dark forest must be built first. And that's what we're doing here today. All right, Ruby?
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Yancey. I want to begin with a seemingly simple question, which may have been answered in the book, but nonetheless, I want us to set the tone and try to figure out, what does the dark forest mean to each of you authors who've been writing for the last 5 years about it? And what is its role in your life as an inhabitant of the metaverse or of the internet? We can begin with Josh.
Sure. Thanks, Ruby. Thanks, Yancey. This is something that kind of took me by surprise. This has been an incredible journey to get to where we are now. What I think is the experience of many people in this group, and certainly for myself, is that the toxic incentives of the attention economy just made any form of debate, deliberation, any semblance of a public sphere impossible on open social media. So downstream of flame wars and sensational context collapse things on Twitter and Instagram and Meta and you name it, this drove, I think, in the first generation, a podcasting renaissance in which people were hungry for enriched, long form conversation, contextually rich conversation. And as a result of that, a lot of these communities that encountered the strong signal of podcasting and newsletters and other forms of media, YouTube videos, for example, they then collected in private communities, dark forests, so to speak, either private discords or Telegram chats or someplace that is gatekept, to use the word. And what slowly happened for me over the last few years is that I began to incrementally opt out of open social media platforms, just in terms of my total amount of screen time, where I'm getting my information from. And it became better to just surf the Discord for a few minutes, get more rich conversation, better forms of information, and that became a more meaningful experience. So I'm very excited to have gotten where we are now. I think the question open to everybody here, I have my own answers for it that we'll talk about later, is that what are the structures that we're going to build? What are these things growing into? Because I believe we're at the threshold of this new period of the internet. I'm very excited about that. And I think for me, it's become the dark forest is an information filtration process. It's a place to create strong social bonds that are much more durable than the attention economy communities on open social media. And it's an opportunity to build new institutions that are unique to the 21st century, that use new tools, new methods of publishing, new methods of coordination, and everything that goes along with it. So yeah, that's the dark forest for me. And then I'll have a lot to say about do not research later in the meeting, I think.
Rebecca, do you want to go next? You're muted.
Sorry. Oh. So, as you can probably tell, I think I might be like the least online person on this call right now. I don't even know how to unmute myself, apparently. So, yeah, I don't really do any social media. All my contact with clients is like, email, really old school. And I obviously chat with people on Telegram and Zoom and stuff. but I'm really off the main thing. My main experience of the dark forest is literal dark forests, where I do spend a lot of time and do a lot of my work as a ritualist and as a sort of, as a person. And then the other sort of dark forest that I wade into quite frequently is the kind of metaphorical dark forest of people's subconscious and their sort of, maybe subconscious isn't even the right word. They're like the things that are just about to become conscious for them as I work with them to create ritual art forms. And I think there's something about those two forests, the literal dark forest, which I venture into, and the dark forests of people's psyches, that is actually really relevant to the dark forest of the internet. Basically, well, the dark forests that I go into literally are not unowned land, but they feel like it. They feel like they're mine. They feel like they're private because it's night and there's no one there. So that's one thing. And that's an interesting thing to consider, who owns this territory. The other thing that I've noticed about real life forests is that just because they're dark, obviously they are not barren. And in fact, like the idea of a forest being empty is kind of crazy because the trees are there, right? So yeah, you're stepping into an ecosystem, you're stepping into a world. And then the other interesting thing that is true of dark forests, literal ones, psychological ones, and internet ones, is that we need to use different senses than the ones we use to navigate in, you know, normal reality. So perhaps my intuition, my feeling senses are turned up when I'm speaking to someone about their psychological dark forest, and my hearing is turned up when I'm in the real dark forest. And I think it'd be interesting to explore what sort of creatures we need to become to navigate in the dark forest of the internet. But yeah, so I'll be representing the people who don't know what they're talking about here tonight for you guys.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Leith, what does the dark forest mean to you?
If I think about it, I mostly think about people, actually, some of which are actually in this room, and like an era as well, which is like the sort of early COVID lockdown kind of era. What I found interesting about it is that like it sort of created this like underlying network of connection. There was a moment where, you know, sort of communicate more with people who are like, you know, on the other side of the planet more than like with my neighbors. And like, I mean, time have changed and, you know, everything has sort of like rematerialized. And like some of that network has sort of like came out of the internet as well. So like the dark forest also became like very physical through time. Like a lot of these people I had never met prior, or like I didn't know prior to like, let's say the, you know, early 2020, and now they're all like really dear friends and collaborators. So I think about it in like those two levels, you know, the sort of like origin kind of story, and like in the way that it's actually taking shape in my life now and the way that it has impacted my life now, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Venkat.
Right. Hey, everybody. Yeah, I think my path to this idea space kind of started somewhere else, but specifically the idea of the dark forest. I don't remember when I read the three-body problem, but definitely I think my understanding of the term is very much in line with the Cixin Liu science fiction version of it, where it's an emergent reality where basically if you're seen, you attract hostility. So it's a very different sense of the term than, like, you know, the pleasant experience of being in a relatively nice North American or European forest. Perhaps not so much, I don't know, Latin American or African or Indian forests where there are a lot more dangerous critters lurking. So yeah, my understanding of the term is definitely the three-body problem one. And my own path to this actually came about as a failure of an older meme of mine. So I think around 2017, I wrote this post called The Premium Mediocre Life of Maya Millennial. And that was kind of like talking about a particular culture in public physical spaces, you know, and also places like Instagram, which was a particular kind of public life. Everybody sort of like was out there in public, basically showing off like a status culture position, to reference Eugene's thing. And around 2018 or so, I kind of noticed that culture retreating, and premium mediocre was no longer a thing. So like a year after I wrote that, it no longer was a thing. And instead people were kind of retreating indoors. And I kind of like tagged it as a millennial to Gen Z kind of shift. And I labeled it domestic cozy. So I started writing a series of blog posts about that. It was mainly about physical spaces, not online spaces. Then I think around May 2019, I started kind of like doing an off take about the cozy idea for online spaces. And that's when I wrote the extended internet universe thing with the cozy web coinage. And I think I encountered Yancey's post like just as I was about to hit publish. So I was like, all right, this is a complimentary idea, and I linked it. And I was writing out the book yesterday, and it struck me that ironically, that kind of like serendipitous hyperlinking is characteristic of the old web, which is what kind of dies when everybody retreats to a cozy web and like accepts the dark forest condition as a given. It's like that kind of serendipity gets harder and harder. So while I enjoy cozy spaces, I think in this round table, I fundamentally represent the view that if you think of the dark forest as consisting of the cozy web as the private spaces and the residual public spaces, I've called that the Internet of Beefs, sort of like ceding the public to the forces of violence and toxicity is kind of like admitting defeat. So I'm in the camp of don't admit defeat. Like the cozy web is a nice temporary place to like gather your forces and like regroup, but fundamentally at some point it'll be time to like go back out there and reclaim the public. So to Yancey's point, I don't think that the dark forest is not constructed. First of all, it kind of emerges out of the the toxicity forces and stuff. And the key is perhaps for me not to like learn to live in it, but to like fight back and reclaim the public. So I don't know. I would like the dark forest era honestly to end and have a healthier public return to center stage. So I'll kind of be representing that viewpoint in this call, I think.
Wonderful. I love some adversariality. Caroline, a little internet.
Hi. So love some of the points that have been made so far. A lot has been covered. Josh, I have to agree with you that the need for a dark forest-like space as an entity took me by surprise as well. I come from mainstream old print media, and it was just apparent by 2016, 17 that you couldn't have that. I mean, I wrote a piece that was saying how there's all this political activity in the ClearNet space, but you're not going to have any agency by acting in that space because you're like feeding the hegemonic order. You're not able to have any distance from it. So you need to be in some kind of cozy web space, to use Venkat's term, or some kind of dark forest in order to have enough objective distance to have any kind of like political resistance. That said, also, as Josh was saying, we're in a very different, and Leith was saying as well, we're in a different time, right? And my thought when I think about the dark forest now, maybe I share some of Venkat's sentiments of I'm kind of over the dark forest in a sense, but it's not because it's not just because I think we've all retreated to our cozy web spaces and are afraid to take on the ClearNet. It's that the ClearNet itself, to borrow Cory Doctorow's term, has become enshittified, and it itself has just balkanized and has just become a very not useful space. So it's not so much about a space of fear. I don't care about being surveilled as much. I mean, in 2017, 2018, it felt like you couldn't have a real conversation in a ClearNet space. And so the fear had something to do with like being afraid of language, being afraid of having real debates, being afraid of confrontation in that space because you'd risk your job, you'd risk alienation from friends, etc. But that ClearNet space is incredibly different now, 5 or 6 years later. And so it's like everything, it's like we're all, like the ClearNet space is also, it's balkanized. So I don't know if dark forest even really applies anymore. I think that yeah, I'm sure we'll get into it in this conversation, but I feel like a shift has already happened. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of dark forest as a return to a human scale and sort of human directed part of the internet, because I mean, the open web is largely directed by or designed to maximize, whatever numbers or incentives or profit targets that the big companies that own them are trying to maximize. So I think of it as it's a dark, you make a dark forest not to hide from people so much as to hide from, I think like the book, from aliens, like artificial intelligence, data scrapers, and targeted advertisers. But I think, of course, no matter what, you're going to have to interface with the wider public. And of course, like with new models, where we talk within our Discord and we broadcast outward. But
Yeah.
yeah, you need that filter, and just gives a more human scale community to
Right.
to your online experience.
Last but not least, Peter, any thoughts on the Dark Forest?
Thank you, Ruby. Thanks for everyone for their shares. I'll keep mine short. One way I view it is if the surface web is an opportunity to find the others, then the Dark Forest is an opportunity to actually get to know them. And regarding the role it's played in my life, the Dark Forest that I was responsible for the last 4 years, the Stoa, has been an opportunity to get to know really incredible and beautiful people. And I do have gratitude for the panelists here. I consider everyone sort of on this panel as like hipster intellectuals giving meta takes on the on the internet. And without them, I wouldn't be able to create the store or navigate the internet the way I did, because they offered kind of new perspectives to see the internet in a fresh way. So I give my gratitude and thanks to you all.
Wonderful. I think this sort of lays the land of the different perspectives on the Dark Forest. I wanted to involve the audience, all of you who have, are part of this collective now, to comment in the chat a word that felt resonant with the book after your first read, assuming, of course, that you've had the time to read it since it arrived to your home. But what word comes to you when you hear the word Dark Forest, or when you after reading the book? Enclaves, locked in. Labyrinth, connection. Green. Wounded, borderless. Thorny, mystery.
This is a great like 2006 word cloud right here. You could build out of this.
I'll let those flow in for a second. One of the themes that struck me reading the book, and also sort of directly with the metaphor, was the assumption of fear, which I think links back a little bit to Venkat's point. I could not help but wonder whether future structures based on fear can actually be sustainable. The members of the Dark Forest in the metaphor are praised. Does this feel true? Does this feel too dramatic? Let's start with Venkat, given that I think you also had this sort of very literal take on the metaphor.
Yes, I think there might be like some elements of seeking human scale and reconnecting, touching grass, all those things are there. But I think the dominant note here is definitely fear. And I've kind of been critical of the fear-based responses for like almost a decade now. I think I first raised it when I was making fun of all the people who go off on retreats doing what is called Walden ponding. So I am a strong critic of Walden ponding. I wrote a sort of polemic called Against Walden Ponding. I think fundamentally fear-based reactions are bad. They might be tactically sound for a period of time to beat a strategic retreat and like gather your forces, but fundamentally life-affirming responses to being alive have to come from a place of something other than fear. So for me, in this conversation, reclaiming the public is a good slogan for me and others who agree with me to rally behind. But yeah, I think ultimately you can't let the public internet or public physical spaces be owned and dominated by, I don't know, the Trumps and equivalent loud voices on the left, and every public conversation being reduced to like ashes. I would like a space, maybe not Twitter ever again, but some space where it's actually possible to have conversations with more than like the 5 friends who all agree with what you say anyway. I'd like to have like global conversations. We are in a planetary era. All our problems are planetary scale. There are 8 billion people on this planet. There needs to be a space where those connections and conversations can happen, and fear is not going to get us there.
Wonderful. Caroline and little, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I'll pick up on that just because I feel like
Yeah.
I'll own the fear. I'll own the fear. I want to talk about where the fear comes from because I think my original post, it's not fear of big tech. It's not fear of, maybe it's fear of like some version of getting canceled. I honestly think it's like fear of being lame. It's just like old fashioned, just straight like I thought that was funny, nobody laughed fear. Even that level. But I think for me as someone like I came up on the internet, like I've always been a message board person, always. And then Kickstarter happened and suddenly I had like a online reputation that was tied to a real world asset. And there's just like pressure, like it all matters. And how can you be yourself? And suddenly there's like, you sense a lot of things at stake in each interaction in a way that feels heavy. And so I think a little bit that was what was going on with me. And it was just a desire to feel free. And for me, I was just sort of examining my own behavior to say, where is it that I feel free? And where is it that I don't feel free? And I think that's kind of where that first started. But there are a lot of other things to be afraid of too, rightly or wrongly. But I'll kick it to Carly and Julian.
On this specific question of fear, is that right, Ruby? We should continue that.
I was going to say that you cultivated through new models a community, I think, which is quite diverse. I think there was some conflict within it, right? Some people with adversarial opinions, but nonetheless, you chose to have something that was outside of the clear net. Let's on this idea of fear. How does that relate to the specific idea of the dark forest and having one of these more private communities?
I mean, first of all, I think we should think about fear in the context of 2017, 2018, and then into COVID versus now. And it's a very different ecosystem. I mean, post vibe shift, right? Like that we don't have those same exact pressures. It resonates with me what Yancey's saying about like fear of seeming like a dork online or something, and feeling like within a cozy web, maybe people would be a bit more forgiving of your lame meme, or they'd understand it somehow. And yeah, vibe shift. How long could you go, right? Without saying it. I think, you know, in terms of fear, Julian and I, we spent a lot of sleepless nights dealing with like meltdowns on the Discord server initially. So it was like far more stressful to run a cozy web space than it was just to like post this dumb tweet or something, like really like on par with having an infant. Sleepless nights. So, and I wouldn't really characterize it as fear as in like, I mean, I didn't feel fear as in my, you know, my body was at risk and somehow. But
I mean,
yeah,
fear was not a motivator though for us.
it was
I
more
don't think.
frustration.
Also just noise. Like
And noise, right? That was really the main.
Yeah. And we always kind of think of these, maybe it's lame, but we always think of these real life metaphors where we're like, you know, it's so much more enriching to have a conversation at a large dinner party than like, you know, 1,000 people running around a mall screaming, which is like what most of the open web is like,
And
social media. So
to Rebecca's point, I really loved what you said about, you know, dark forests aren't empty. They're not barren. They're rich ecosystems. What we really craved was a richer ecosystem. And we felt like things were driving towards monoculture, like a monoculture opinion. You know, nobody says what they think anymore, but they still perform a certain kind of politics. And we wanted a richer ecosystem. And I also like the real ecosystem metaphor, because I think we wanted a barbed environment. We wanted to feel pain and to feel joy in a maybe more intense way. And that seemed more possible in a dark forest space.
Could I jump in quickly on this topic of fear? Because I think it's actually it's a very powerful pressure point. And I know several people, more than a few, two of them recently, who have lost their jobs, their livelihood, because of things that they've said on the internet. And there's real stakes to this stuff now. Context collapse is real. I think fear is kind of an understandable response because there are real dangers out on the internet, especially if you're talking about sensitive political topics and something gets clipped out of context, circulates at orders of magnitude larger than human scale, and so on. So I am absolutely, I mean, I've written about this. I entirely agree with Venkat that the purpose of the dark forest is to later emerge, to rebuild consensus reality. All of that absolutely necessary. But I think alongside the arc of the last few years is also the emergence of this industry called disinformation, where there are things that are true, but were not possible to say in public. So my favorite example of this is the Hunter Biden laptop, where, you know, to me, those images, that looks pretty real. I don't think this is AI or disinformation or so on. But that was literally technically impossible to transmit to people through Twitter at the time. So that's just, you know, one example of the tip of this enormous iceberg, but there are true things that cannot be said in the public sphere. So I would characterize today's information ecosystem as being comprised of already delegitimized institutions. So the purpose of retreating into the dark forest is to build a new consensus of disparate agonistic forces where the content that is emanating from the strong signal of the individual podcast or the newsletter, whatever media stream this happens to be, it needs to be sufficiently complex that it brings in people who have competing views on this. And in the pursuit of truth, by having this rigorous, contextual, rich conversation, we can again find that truth to later emerge into the public sphere with legitimate institutions. So that means I'm borrowing here from Carly, which is, I think, maybe the new model's answer to Venkat's proposal called Light Leak, which is to periodically allow works, essays, videos, lectures, and so on to escape from the dark forest and to be published back onto the clear net. And so I see like the process of the next few years is to try and build new legitimate structures, new institutions that can compete with the outmoded versions we currently have available. But unless we do that period of building, producing legitimacy, producing new institutions, then I don't see like a meaningful force to compete in a world that is already so thoroughly controlled and partitioned and so on.
I love the idea of the light leak. It's very evocative. Rebecca, I'm curious if you have any thoughts given sort of the physicality of your practice on the notion of fear and how it may push people towards these more recluse communities.
Yeah, I think your question about building on fear, or the dubiousness of the idea of building things on fear, is right on point. But I don't think we can reject fear or escape fear, or like I think that's kind of a fantasy that we can live without fear, obviously. So I think there's something about a sort of a narrative arc that happens within our lives, and it's not really an arc, it's a cycle, where we move through fear at different points, and this is a process of, you know, of becoming. This is how we become who we are, or who we're going to be, or because I'm not sure that there is like this destination. But so to go through the fear, and then instead of building on it, to use it like as a raw material, to use it consciously and to experience it in the same way we experience other things that we can use. So to just, I think, sort of shifting from seeing our fear as something that can come up and possess us almost demonically, right? To see it as something that we can experience. And if we can sit with it and sit through it and feel those uncomfortable feelings, then we can actually use it, and it becomes something we can make art with, which I think is what we're all interested in doing, really. And to be honest, I think the only thing we can do at this moment. So yeah, that's my take on fear. I love it.
I love that, the transmuting it or transfiguring it from darkness to light. Peter.
Yeah, to riff off what Rebecca just said, I don't think fear is inherently bad. And my definition of courage is doing good in the presence of fear. So if like one of the projects of is to reclaim the public commons, as Venkatesh argues, then you know, there's going to be fear in our system doing it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then kind of responding to the original question about fear more generally, or how that relates to sort of the journey or my journey to the dark forest. It's kind of similar to Yancey's thing about like it not being cool. But there's this like term in therapeutic and spiritual spaces of like not being seen, and like being seen meaning like being intellectually or emotionally understood. And if you're like constantly misseen, it's like just like an act of existential violence, and it's boring. I don't want to be like, I don't want to play this game where I'm just like tweeting things out and people are just like, like not understanding what I'm talking about because of the context collapse and whatnot. So I'm interested in, I was interested in creating online spaces, and now more in-person spaces where I can selfishly feel deeply seen and give other people the opportunity to feel deeply seen. Yeah, so I think that is sort of the one of the fears I have is not having that opportunity.
Amazing. And Leith?
Yeah, the way I used to think about it was more under the idea of platform migration. I think it's just that traditional social media just became like a inhospitable environment, and people just decided to move elsewhere simply. But beyond that, I think there's just the idea of refusal. People just decided, like, that it wasn't worth their time to engage through those channels, and instead just like, find ways to spend their time online more meaningfully and sort of, we're speaking about like real life metaphors, but I think, speaking through Twitter or Instagram very much feels like, being on a stage and speaking through a megaphone, but everyone has their own little stage and their own megaphone, which I think, is not like sustainable, but also that's not necessarily what you need or like what you want to be doing all the time. And I think our first spaces just like have different affordances could actually enable, people to interact with each other rather than just like speaking to the void. So yeah, rather than fear, I would just speak about like refusal actually, which is probably like a more sort of like active positioning in response to like an ecosystem or like an environment.
Yeah, and Leith, I want to drill down on this idea of it being inhospitable. A lot of these platforms have this inherent adversarial, like they're adversarial. What is the cause in your mind of this opposition that is on these platforms with all these megaphones?
I think there's a moment where like one realizes that like the platform is not their friend. And for me it was also in the early 2020. I think it was like post the assassination of George Floyd, and when I saw my entire feed just like on fire, and I just started to retrieve. I think that day I just decided that I wouldn't engage with Instagram in any sort of like meaningful way. Sort of I stopped posting any form of political content because I just felt like there was no use for that, or that would always like backfire. And I made myself a promise, which was to only post jokes since then. So like I've just been posting work and jokes on Instagram since 2020, and that's been going well. But also, it's like those platforms have become really good at just like crystallizing sort of social tensions and like promoting outrage, just sort of they're just like models based on attention, right? So it's like whatever will produce the more click will just be the sort of way to go. And like platforms like Discord or I guess Slack at that point were like inherently like group coordination platforms. So they just had different affordances. And I think basically as long as one can sort of like retrieve from like dynamics which are being or promoted or generated through like algorithms, the better. And so I don't think it has to do with like the internet being necessarily adversarial. It's just like specific type of platforms, and I guess like also the physics of those platforms, as like Julian and Carly have spoken about like quite like extensively. And it's like Venkatesh was speaking about the internet of beefs, but after all those years on Discord, like my last video work, which was my MFA graduation work, was titled The Internet of Friends. And it was like a sort of like synthesis of those few years that I spent in those online spaces and actually like showcasing like, like the people that I had met in there as well. So I think it's just like it's quite interesting to sort of like, be at a certain point, like have the internet of beef, and a few years down the line have like a project called the Internet of Friends. I was not aware of the internet of beef back then, but I think it's a good sort of like opposition there.
I'm curious, Yancey, if you have any thoughts on the cause of this opposition, maybe not from the personal standpoint as you explained, but more like generally speaking.
I think there are none of us that I'm aware of live in countries where we face true adversarial monitoring danger, needing to VPN to do anything. So there's a reality of fear that is like we're all just LARPing in our own minds. But yeah, I just think it's most fears are projections of ourselves and like what we fear about ourselves. And I keep being brought to the same vibes that Carly and Peter are talking about, of maybe being slightly more introverted in certain ways, feeling like the mall example Julian sound. I'm still like anxious from that vision he shared, and just longing for a context in which we feel like we make sense. And I think for some of us, we were privileged to grow up in the earlier web that just genuinely was smaller, and especially was not operated through feeds. I think it's feeds that create that sorting, that so clearly illuminate the status rankings that exist. I think when Twitter was the most negative force of my life is when I already have a sense of like, on a status list, I'm the 7 billionth most interesting person in the world, and I know exactly everyone who's above me. And every time I see them, I feel it deeply in my soul. And like the internet just made that just like inarguable. And so you're like, how do I escape from this comparison? How do I escape from? And so I think a lot of it is internal, but those feelings are real, and those feelings are shared by billions of people. And there are people who can stand up in a room and debate and, throw down in that way. Venkat is that person. Then there are, people like me that like, okay, I'll do that for like 3 issues, but the rest I'm going to hang back, and I'm just not that guy. And so there's just like a different social affordance that I feel like where we click best. And then ultimately you're afraid that other people are judging you the way you judge them, I think. I hope no one looks at me the way I look at them, is like a maybe an unsaid anxiety too that's a part of it. But that's genuinely how I come at it.
Josh, I'm curious if your research on ideologies here is also as a role to play in the constant opposition that people feel on these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really goes back to the different financial models that subtend these social communities or platforms, what have you. So, I've talked about this at length with both Julian and Carly and a number of other people on this call, but like I would just offer as an example, Do Not Research, which is an arts organization that we've built in the last few years, beginning with a reading group on Discord, people collaboratively publishing their work and so on. We've produced, we're now starting year 3, and we've produced 2 400-page books in the last 2 years. We're working towards our 3rd. So, this is a relatively small group of people. Let's say we've published approximately 250 people. That is, even that threshold is like not possible within the physics, so to speak, of open social media. So looking at how advertising creates overwhelming incentives that are orders of magnitude, that are kind of inescapable, that are like gravity or physics. There's just extreme tendencies to produce hyper niche specific and inflammatory forms of personal branding, essentially, that may mimic or mirror things that appear like politics, but are actually this kind of weird long tail. I'm thinking of the famous essay by Chris Anderson in Wired Magazine, 2006, The Long Tail, right? This was one of the early models of looking at how the internet was going to flourish into all these nicheified communities. And so on spaces of social media, they're not especially valuable or that heavily trafficked. I mean, I think you see those things all the time. So if anyone is not familiar, Ideologies is a long-form series I've been working on for the past few years that involves flags of political iconography that are come up with, that are kind of haphazardly invented, postulated by young people who inhabit political spaces online, where you get incredibly long hyphenated niche political ideologies like queer anarcho-transhumanism, anarcho-primitivist caliphatism, libertarian neo-monarchism. The list goes onwards and upwards ad infinitum. So part of that is just they love to fight and debate and produce a dissensus on ad-driven social media. What happens, and I think is part of this process, in the life cycle of the internet, is that once you start to introduce minimal points of friction, meaning paywalls at an affordable level that doesn't price out young, talented people who, are often in school and working and overburdened with debt and whatever, just a small $5 paywall introduces enormously different, foundationally changing physics to the community, which allows them to coordinate in different ways. So yeah, lots and lots of new things open up, and I think there's the possibility to produce new forms of consensus rather than dissensus once you introduce different financial models that subtend the system. All of that said, we are now watching, I wrote about this recently in a piece called The Platform Wars, where every platform is introducing $5 rolling subscriptions, long-form posts for premium users, video content. There's now streaming on Instagram. There's stories on Twitch, so on and so forth. Let's look at the clock now and wait until Meta introduces newsletters, and then basically every platform has the identical set of tools. What that turns into eventually is this kind of siloed model of the internet, which produces an entirely different ecosystem than what we have now. So yeah, it's just important to, I guess, look at the financial models underpinning these things and not run the risk of naturalizing the adversarial dynamics or the affordances of any particular platform, because these things are growing and changing over time.
We've mentioned the word physics a few times. For those who haven't received your book yet, I would love for Carly and Julian to explain from their holographic media essay, what is the concept of physics of media? I think that may help the group here.
I mean, it's just, I can't be the first person who started using this metaphor, but for some reason I was using it all the time and it stuck. I basically talk about the UX and the sort of incentive mechanisms of social media platforms, say retweets and likes, and the way recommendation algorithms work as physics, because they are as unchangeable and have as drastic of sort of butterfly effects, kind of like very complex nth order effects as a result of them that you can't really anticipate, that they might as well be something like gravity or the physics of the universe.
I mean, specifically, we're thinking about it. We were trying to theorize how media flows differently. You have linear media, then you have nonlinear media. Now you have something that we'd say is holographic media, or as K.L. Adam McDowell talks about, neural media in a time of AI media forms. But how does a piece of content flow through a network? Well, it's subject to certain physics, and the physics on Twitter are going to be different than the physics on Facebook or different than TikTok, because it's going to have a certain velocity, or it's going to have a certain, it's going to react in certain ways based on the protocols of these platforms. So physics just seemed like a really natural and easy way to shorthand it. And maybe to what Josh's point, I agree with you, all these platforms are starting to have the same feature set, but they're going to be different kinds of planets, right? Like they're going to have different kinds of physics. So content will flow differently in each of these platforms, even though they're going to have very similar feature sets.
And people are eventually nudged and shaped by the physics of a particular platform. I mean, after a while, it influences what the content even is in the first place, and
right,
what
and the
people's behaviors are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very small things can have like really kind of drastic, wild, complex effects.
What do you mean by butterfly effects? Like,
Yes.
what is the Conway's Game of Life is always the example that you
Well,
give.
that's like very, that's a
right,
visual metaphor. It's
right.
very hard to
Okay, right. But like one variant changing, one like piece of
Right.
code changing.
4 very simple rules can
Right.
give rise to like
Very different
immensely
ecosystems.
complex
Yeah.
patterns that have behaviors similar to life on just a 2D grid.
Right.
Look it up and you'll understand. But
Carly and Julian, you mentioned illegibility as a mode of resistance against mids in your essay. What are the trade-offs between illegibility, being opaque, and the desire to build a community as a dark forest?
I mean, I think it's come up a few times that dark forests can't be constructed. They have to be emergent, right? And so in some ways, I feel like that question sort of solves itself, where your dark forest is going to form at sort of the level of legibility and opacity or illegibility that's right for your dark forest. And you're going to have some spaces that are really trying to net a larger mass. And so they're going to have affordances of legibility. They're going to use terms like in non subcultural ways. They're going to try to be legible to a lot of people. And then you're going to have spaces that are either, I mean, I think you think of like a Miladies community or something that like uses them in kind of skizzed out ways very intentionally. But I think I think that it's dependent on these dark forests are emergent. And I think that the balance of legibility and illegibility is just going to it's somehow it can't be overthought. It can't be overdetermined. It's going to happen somewhat organically. And whoever is helping to shape that community will push, say, like an emoji set in a Discord to like more mainstream references that are like kind of like more like international signage if they want a broader community, or it'll be more like populated with emotes of like inside jokes or something if you want like a more insidery community.
I mean, it's also just adding a bit of friction to your language or whatever symbols you're putting out, which if the kind of people who can work past the friction and understand the meaning, those are the kind of people you might then connect with, or you might share something with that would make them a good member of your dark forest community, say. But I mean, when we're talking about like the mid in that, though, it's really about the kind of human centipede era we're in right now of Netflix, where it's like content designed by
#cinema. Shout out. Yeah.
But content designed by algorithm, by committee of millions essentially, and then like fed back to them, and to really break this, you kind of need things that are difficult to read by machines and by humans to some extent. But again, I think that I think part of the influence for it, just like with the dark forest, is to maintain a sort of illegibility to machine or to bots, I think. And there's a bit of
time being. I mean, that's always like
there's a bit of it too that's a kind of putting a little friction to help find like-minded peers.
There's also like a degree of encryption, which is, I guess, like voluntary. Like when you think about, I don't know, like the current sort of like watermelon emoji, for example, and like finding ways to sort of like bypass like algorithmic filtering. But otherwise, there's like another dimension to encryption, which I think that is just natural. Like groups just like build language together. Could it be visual or like through text, And it's like, yeah, I mean, I don't know where I was heading, but I guess my point is clear enough. Yeah.
If we speak in the idiosyncratic language of memes, how do the different forests communicate? Peter, I know that your essay really touched on this sort of movement from the initial group towards the chapel and whatnot. How do we get the forest to communicate?
So assuming that these dark forests should communicate, because maybe some of them shouldn't, but let's assume that they should. The skill that I've been focusing on is what's some called transperspectival, being able to have the capacity to hold multiple perspectives of reality without collapsing into any one of them. So how I try to do that is become really intimate with like someone's jargon, or like this mimetic tribe's jargon, and then the particular definition space, but also their philosophy and their axiomatic claims of what reality is and what it ought to be. So in principle, if I can pass someone's ideological Turing test or their philosophical Turing test, meaning I have the capacity to convince them I believe what they believe, when I actually don't, I think that's half the project. And I think the other half of the project is to feel what they would feel believing what they believe to be true. And Jack Hunter, he's an anthropologist. He calls this ontological flooding. So it's actually allowing someone's like ontology of their way of being, their experience of being, to feel it in your body is a quite trippy thing. And I think if you could do both of those things, map someone's proposition space on their own terms, and then feel fully what they feel, then I think you can pretty much talk to anyone.
Rebecca, in
I
your
also
view,
think, yeah, I was just going to jump on that before you even invited me to. Yeah, I think there's actually something really beautiful in the sloppiness of the communication between the Dark Forest and the fact that we miss each other's memes. And I'm with Peter. This is the kind of work we were trying to do in Chapel Perilous, right? To achieve a sort of status almost like radical from the root agnosticism, so that you can take on other ideas and other people's perspectives and explore them, and then push the boundaries of your selfhood. But what we kept finding is, even like Peter's coming from originally from the Stoic scene, and I'm coming from, I don't know, like the skeptic rationalist scene once upon a time, obviously left that far behind now. But and we were close, that's not too far away, right? But we're still missing each other. And there's something really cool about that. And in that space where we're missing each other and where we're misunderstanding each other and mistranslations are going on, something is being formed. And it's not my idea and it's not his idea. It's an idea that's coming up between us, which is what, ends up being the piece that we create. And what we're all doing now here, with all our slightly different visions of what the Dark Forest is, and what it could be, and how it works, and how it shouldn't work, and how it should work. And even just if you think about it, like, when we all close our eyes, we are envisioning a different Dark Forest, and yet it's the same Dark Forest. And I think there's something almost slightly occult about that action. We're bringing something to life, or yeah, I don't know. I think the fact that we don't understand each other might not be a bug of human interaction. I think it actually might be a godsend.
that's really beautiful. I have a hypothesis that perhaps after the chapel, the next thing is the commons, right? Which brings me to Venkat's idea of reclaiming them. How do you envision this reclamation of the commons, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I was going to jump in on the last question as well. So thanks for prompting me, because it's, I think, a good segue point. I think how the Dark Forest communicates, there's been some chatter in the comments about cryptography, and I think blockchains and things like that are a very explicit form, but there's also a soft cultural form of cryptography in human communication. So like, steganography, elliptical communication, shibboleths, things like that. And if you look at the years before we ended up in our current Dark Forest situation, like 2015 to 2017 or so, there was something I would call a gray forest condition, maybe. Not completely dark, so maybe it's a mix of light and dark leaks going. But the gray forest condition was like benign enough that you could actually survive in places like Twitter, in growing hostile forces, and still be safe. And I want to shout out to my one-time co-blogger on Ribbonfarm, Sarah Perry. She was a master at this. So a lot of her fans wanted her to create a Discord or something, but she resisted, and her fans typically just hung out on Twitter, but they all knew each other and were in each other's mentions, and they didn't have any of these problems with, noise or entryism and like other like toxicity problems. And they used to refer, I'm sort of outing them since it's a dumb subculture now. They used to call themselves UST. I think it stood for unaffiliated sloth Twitter. So people who kind of lurked like gray men. So it's very similar to gray man culture in like, the survivalist crowd. Like gray men are people who, instead of like wearing tactical gear and strutting around with guns, they like fly under the radar. They look like normal people, but they're prepared for the apocalypse. And if the zombies appear, they will fight, right? So the gray subcultures on Twitter were like that around 2015 to 2017. Weird Sun Twitter was another like that. So I think reclaiming the public doesn't necessarily have to look like, I don't know, some cartoon version of like ancient Greeks strutting around in the public square in togas or whatever. It doesn't look like that. It can be this public place where we all are pretty good at coded and elliptical communications, steganography, things like that. Public doesn't have to mean everybody understands you or that people are on soapboxes shouting. It means that there is optionality to connect to anybody anywhere else in the world who's able to actually grok and like enter your communication spaces, right? So you don't need these hard-edged boundaries of like Discord signups and code of conduct barriers. Instead, it's more like proof of vibes is a good way to put it. It's like you're in public, but in a more gray way, and you're finding each other in slightly encrypted ways, and you're coming up with like sophisticated guerrilla means of communication that allow you to survive. So I think this is one. So we were in the gray forest getting into the dark forest, and I think we'll be in a gray zone getting out of the dark forest as well. And maybe past that, there's a new kind of public that emerges. But I think in the immediate short term, a good idea might be to rebuild the gray forest, actually.
I like that idea as like almost like a liminal space between them where they can communicate. Yancey, I'm
Let me
curious.
turn one more idea. I meant to mention that anti-memes belong in this conversation. Like in the book, there is no anti-memetic bureau. It's like, anti-memes are like weaponized forms of coziness where you're not retreating to your corner, but you're coming out and communicating in a way which is literally invisible to anybody who might be hostile to you, but you're not suffering for it. You're ranging around the world, but are able to like protect your communications with anti-memes. So just wanted to throw that in there as well.
What would be an example of an anti-meme if you can?
So I think steganographic communication is a good one. Like all of us in this conversation are using the term legibility. And if you're not familiar with the sort of like term of art in the sense of James Scott seeing like a state, which I think it became popular around 10, 12 years ago. I did a blog post reviewing the book and lots of other people did, and it sort of became a thing. But when we are talking about the term legibility, there's a subset of us that understands it, but to everybody else who thinks it's just a normal English word, that conversation is invisible, right? So that's a kind of like literal example of an anti-meme in a way.
Yancey, do you have any thoughts on the communication between the different forests if they are willing to do so?
Well, I feel like I think the points that Venkat has raised, that New Models has raised, and really that the trust piece, Arthur and Alex's piece in the book on moving castles really encapsulates well, where really the goal is the dark forest to be where you conspire. But ultimately, for a lot of groups, the reason for conspiring is to manifest some public work that is standing for whatever it is your group is about, or bringing in new members, but it's like the dark forest is it's just the land of conspiring. And so I think that there's a lot of modes of governance and gatekeeping about how open or closed you want those things to be. I think those are hard things to force. They just are they're kind of who shows up is a lot of how these things happen. But I agree that like it's not just about hanging out in a cozy space. I mean, there's a lot of that. That's what like my group chats are about. That's just kicking it. But this feels like there is an intentionality that's greater than that. That feels really important to like maybe that line between a group chat and a dark forest.
Josh, your project, Do Not Research, I think tries to deal with the physics of previous platforms like building new institutions. How does one balance the need for visibility for crowdfunding the efforts with the protection and the invisibility of the dark forest?
Yeah, there's something to do with this recent history of the internet that hits an inflection point at which it fundamentally changes. I'm thinking of the period where my peer group, it wasn't coincidental that everyone I collaborated with on jogging, let's say 2011 to 2013, which was an artist collaborative project, primarily posted to Tumblr, and then started doing physical in-person exhibitions, making sculptures, artworks, and so on. All of those people graduated around the same time. They all joined Facebook around the same time, and they just so coincidentally happened to find each other through those, the relatively smaller communities at the time. What happens in 2012, if you look at the growth curve for open social media, is that your mom, dad, aunt, and uncle joins Facebook around 2012. All of a sudden, it's much harder to find peers and like-minded people and whatever. So I tend to think that, my initial peer group that I collaborated with, we were the, unaware and unintentional beneficiaries of just being the early adopters of this social media question. So if you transpose that same type of community building and collaboration and so on, you try to recreate the same projects and the same conditions now, I find myself in a position where I'm not technically an educator now. I've taught at universities in the past, but there are many people who listen to the podcast, read the newsletter, watch the Twitch streams, so on and so forth. And many of them are recent graduates of BFA or MFA programs. It's kind of like a professor-student relationship outside of a conventional university. Those people are having much more difficult times gaining any sort of momentum or visibility for their creative work. So what I saw was a group of people, my peer group, that all bootstrapped together this collaborative project. And then the incentives emerged during that period for people to actually break apart their collaboration. Everyone started to get individual solo shows based off of the visibility that they got from that work. I think that this is a cyclical process that creative industries go through, where at some points it is advantageous for musicians to release work through a record label. At other times, it is advantageous for a musician to be independent, and it depends what those projects are case by case. In general, I think the art world, which is where I'm most specifically invested in, I think that we are in a cycle of rebundling. And I'll just give you a very practical example of what this means. So for all of the people who contribute to Do Not Research, many of them are on the younger side. We accept work from people who, it's a quality-based assessment. We're not looking at their CVs, screening people for their credentials and whatever. We believe on building consensus outside of the legitimating forces that, subtend every other application you might get. We're willing to give people their first shot. The problem is that they can make really excellent, very compelling, extraordinarily fabricated, well-written works that just get no visibility, no likes, no subscribes, nothing in the creator economy model of the internet. What happens is if you put all of those creative works together, you will get curators, dealers, artists, critics, donors, philanthropists. Those people will follow one account that aggregates the work of the combined creative efforts of 250 people. They're not going to follow 250 25-year-olds. That's just too much noise to signal. So that then has a literal financial value, which is, to be fair, modest, but it allows for donations. And you're looking at a creative environment where everyone has this already sunk cost of the work that they've created that sinks to the bottom of an algorithmic feed. So I'm recognizing curation right now, curators and editors as being proof of a market failure within the algorithmic sorting of the internet, that these things literally are valuable. There's a financial model through subscribers on Substack and different donations, ways that you can quantify it. They're also, culturally valuable in a way that you can't put a price on it. It's like these are things that are the most meaningful experiences that creative people have in their lives. They encounter a novel that changes their way of looking at the world, or a film, an essay that makes them cry, see the world differently. All of those things, different forms of value, equally important, in some cases more so important. That, I think, leads you to a model of the internet where if you're doing your work, it's better to squat up. It's better to squat up than to do it out on your own. And I'll give you just one example of this, that a good friend of mine was very involved in Ultima Online, which was an early MMORPG that had a lot of PvP zones, meaning that when you're going through this dangerous swamp or forest or territory, whatever, someone could kill you and take all your gold and take all your items and whatever. And so what that created was an environment where it was only safe to go somewhere if you had your whole crew with you. Because then if one guy is trying to fuck with you, if he's trying to kill you, steal your gold and your precious items, you've got, a gang of people to back you up. And so that just created all of these other really important social dynamics. The kind of end result was that people created really strong social bonds on top of their shared material interests. So if it all sits in the dark forest, if it is never exposed to anyone, obviously that is a failure. That, like, the point is to produce these creative works that are then shown back to a public. But I think there's just kind of a clear analysis of what people had been posting before, and the opportunities and the resources that were afforded to them versus republishing that material as a squad and getting new opportunities and new resources. There's just a clear cost benefit analysis that your beneficially for us as institution builders right now, your selfish material interests are best served by participating in a squad. So I think it makes all of those things very easy at this moment.
Venkat, I'm curious about your point here. I think that there potentially is a narrowness in our perspective. If you want to speak to what you've seen inhabiting the Indian cozy web, and how it may differ from its Western counterpart.
So maybe it's more similar than I'm implying in the comments, but yeah, I mean, Indian WhatsApp is a utterly toxic space. It's mostly like family and friends group, extremely small local communities. And it's horrifying. Like, you probably know that Indian politics is shaped by Hindu-Muslim conflict, especially with the current BJP Hindu nationalist party in power. And in the 80s, when I was growing up, there used to be a lot of pluralist, sort of like syncretic sentiment. People in different religions try to understand each other. In the last 15 years, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And WhatsApp is now full of like what I consider raving lunatics who kind of, I don't know, like on the Hindu side, consider Muslims to be the absolute evil devil and vice versa. And there's similar stuff happening in the Islamic world. And part of me is extremely sad about that, because the cozy web, and this is a problem we recognized for years, that you get in your own filter bubbles, you will radicalize and polarize more. You see elements of that in like Facebook groups and stuff in the US as well. But I think it's particularly sharp in older parts of the world with, like, if you have 2000 years of angry, toxic history of fighting in every place you can find, when you go to WhatsApp, it's going to get far uglier than when you just have like 400 years, right? So the longer you have been fighting, the more intense and dirty the fighting will be. So I wanted to point that out. And also, in the same way, I wanted to point out that there are precedents to the dark forest sort of like model in history. Like speaking of Islam, there's a doctrine in Islam called taqiyya, which basically says if you're a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim country, you dissimulate, you be a gray man or gray woman and like basically pretend to get along with everybody in the majority community. And of course, when the tables turn, I'm sure there's other norms for other minorities, but it tells you that this is not a new problem and that the cozy web and dark forest are not panaceas. Like if you retreat, you will polarize, you will radicalize, you will sort of like unleash the worst parts of yourself in the darkness. So you will become what you fear. You'll become sort of the evil you think you're escaping from. So I don't like that. So even though I'm like in this conversation, I think fundamentally I'm more skeptical of what happens in dark, cozy spaces than supportive.
I think beyond like, oh, sorry to cut you. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Leith.
Yeah, I think like other than just like focusing on the Western context, I think like something that's happening here is that we're speaking about like dark forest and this sort of like abstract term, but in a way, I think what the book does also is like document like a very specific and like located scene of like cultural producers at the end of the day that I guess we sort of like named the dark forest kind of like environment. Like Yancey was mentioning the moving castle piece, which was sort of like speculating on the future of the dark forest and, you know, potential like isolation and trying to think about how to create bridges between communities. But that was also without considering, Jack, who's here, might remember someone once saying, oh, actually the dark forest is the same 15 people just moving from Discord server to Discord server. And of course, like I've been spending like some time on Telegram over the last few months, and even like in the Western context, I mean, I've just like encountered like the worst possible things ever, and like, you know, countless sort of, you know, group chats of like, you know, French far right, you know, neo-Nazi sort of group. So like I think in a Western context we have the sort of like same trash. It's just that here we're mostly speaking like sort of like trying to document again, you know, like a very located scene and like subcultural sort of like ecosystem.
The book mentions a lot of different structures: group chats, DAOs, forums, Discords, Telegrams, now WhatsApps as well. Which do you foresee having an enduring power in the upcoming years? And which do you on a personal level prefer? Rebecca.
So I think I might have Walden Ponded for a little while just then. I just came back from a bit of a retreat at the spring equinox. And for 6 months, I was very limited my internet use. And in the last 6 weeks of that, I was completely offline, as in I did not even message my friends. But I did receive like letters in the mail from my friends and sent them. And it was fucking lovely. It really was. So again, representing the people who are not as internet savvy as the average person on this chat, I'd say I genuinely think, and I mean, maybe this is crazy, but I genuinely think that exchanging physical items with people or touching people, stuff like that, that's what I'm into. And the beauty of that as an artist is obviously you have materials to play with that are coming in your post books that you can cut up and collage and recreate and do a kind of physical examination of what we're all doing here on the screen. So yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not the person to ask on this question, but the raw mail works for me.
Peter, any thoughts on your preferred mode of community reclusion?
Well, I relate with a lot with Rebecca is saying, because the last like 3 years I've been trying to be less and less on this thing, less in front of the screens. And I don't want to put my life force and kind of like just, you know, creating an avatar and then making it go viral. And so out of all the spaces online, I prefer this Zoom room, actually. We have at the Stoa every morning, we have collective journaling where we just kind of jump on a Zoom call for 90 minutes. We play some music. People do check-in, then we journal in silence together for 90 minutes as an accountability group. And it's beautiful. It's been existing for like, you know, 3-4 years. And the next best place is offline for me. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Carly and Julian?
I think maybe that would help. Right. Kind of to Venkat's point, what he calls anti-memes. I mean, my feeling, and this goes back also to this enshittification of ClearNet spaces and coming out of our dark forest spaces and being more permeable, making those barriers more permeable. I think that we're going to develop dark forest vernaculars, which are going to, this is, Julie and I spoke about something called holographic media, this idea that we're going to be finding each other in certain ways across all of these platforms. And to Josh's point, that all these platforms are competing with each other and are becoming more similar in the feature sets they offer, even if not in the physics, that it's not going to settle on any one platform. And even if it did, it would be temporary and, you know, then somebody else would buy it and it would change or whatever. And I really think we're getting towards, also, we haven't spoken at all about AI, and obviously that's outside of the scope of this book, but it's going to fundamentally change the way that we're using any of these platforms, the way the feeds are working, the way media is sensing us, it's sensing us back. And it's going to be necessary to, I mean, maybe this is where, you know, Josh is talking about bands of people moving through spaces together. I think we're going to be moving across ClearNet spaces together as bands of people who are using a vernacular with, you know, a certain kind of emoji set or insider set. And maybe, I mean, I I'm not up enough on like who's working on what in Web3 or if any of these projects are still alive, but you can imagine like some kind of like token enabled meta layer that allows you to use these different spaces as dark forests. But almost you don't even need to. There's a certain style of writing a post that identifies you as part of a certain group. And I think we're going to see an increasing amount of that. And some of the smarter groups may develop ways of like gating, like, or like aggregating, filtering, thank you, filtering, yeah, like aggregating content, like, you know, whatever, like local radio streams for certain communities or local information pools. And I think that we're going to be using all available resources. We're just going to be like deterring that. Like, can you deter X? Can you deter Instagram? Can you deter on TikTok or like whatever other platforms come up? And that's going to become increasingly the norm. So anytime a new platform comes up, you and your community are going to bring it in and develop a protocol, really like a social protocol for how you use it. And that could be using it the wrong way. And so that's I don't know, that's like, I mean, and it's kind of hopeful, I guess, as well. It's like learning, I don't know, some kind of like agrarian stage of like living symbiotically with a forest and the plain as well.
I mean, I also just want to second the sentiment though. Like, I mean, part of the reason to have a dark forest is to spend as little time online as possible. Like, if you're the less time spent like searching and like navigating noise and filtering and like battling with your own attention, to not get distracted by bait, and the less time spent in slot machine variable reward loops, the better. And you know, when you have a community of peers online who all act as sort of filters and share information that you know, that everyone finds valuable, I mean, it just yeah, allows you to not have so much time wasted online. I mean, I always think about how amnesiac time online is, like, because it's you know, just like one or two senses involved. Like, I mean, memory is embodied, like it smells, it's feeling, it's sight, sound, taste, all of these different things. And your brain is not very good at making strong memories of your time online. And so a lot of time spent online, which is really scary to me, is like blank memory, like kind of like fuzzy, non-chronological, just like sort of erased time. I think about like on your deathbed, if your life truly does flash before your eyes and like you see mostly fucking crypto charts and like forgotten memes, like that's horrifying. So I think, yeah, I mean, part of these communities is meant to spend as little as time as possible online.
And I think spending time in these communities and knowing how to navigate these platforms, like coming up with a shared protocol for it, will physically make the bodies in your community better, because your bandwidth won't be given over to slot machine type of mental. Yeah. It will be a healthier embodied experience as well.
Yancey, I'd like to turn it over to you for your favorite mode of dark foresting.
Well, I'm just loving all of this. This is just all the energy. I'm soaking it in. Yeah, trying to be offline more, definitely a goal that I fail at every day. But certainly a lot of things start there. But if I think about my own attention, there's like a handful of Telegram groups that I'm in that I feel like are my best sources of information. Not the type Venkat and Leith are talking about, but I just find that the places where people will be real and say, hey, this thing like was fucked up, or did anyone notice this thing? It just feels more valuable to me. And I was reflecting recently how that, I think I've had a couple of experiences in the past few years that have changed how I think about how I communicate even. Like the original Dark Forest essay, I had a tiny letter then. It was 300 people, I think, that it went to. And then I guess it light leaked out of there to become more widely read. But like when I first had the ideas that led to Metalabel, I initially had planned to just put that into a Substack and blast it out, but had this gut feeling that I was just going to be really disappointed by what happened out of that. Like it was just going to be a big nothing. And so instead took the Google Doc where I was working on the idea and just sent it exactly like Josh shared, the difference between dark forest and public sharing, but I just sent it to 5 people directly and just said, hey, I wrote this thinking about you, wondering what you think. And as I did that, I realized, oh, when I was going to send that Substack, I was actually hoping these 5 people would like email me and just be very generous with their reactions, which of course was never going to happen. But instead, I directly reached out to these people and shared a private document, and every single one of them responded. And that repeatedly happening is what led to that essay becoming a project in Metalabel. And when Metalabel last year left crypto, wrote a thing that I similarly didn't want to share widely, but people were asking why we were doing this. And so I just shared a private Google Doc with comments on, which ended up getting widely shared, I think because it was private. And those things revealed in my own draw to like being more interested in clicking into Telegram than say Twitter to like catch up on things, says there is something to private information that feels more valuable, that maybe I trust a little bit more. Maybe the incentives feel a little different, although maybe they're not actually. But if I just self-examine, I do feel more drawn to that. And I do instinctively feel like, oh, that's where I want to go with my ideas first. Maybe it's validation, maybe it's like getting your initial whatever core group of people who give a shit, or you're getting your first round of feedback. But more and more, that's what I'm seeing happen with my own behavior and attention.
We have 2 more questions, and then we'll go to the audience for some Q&A. So prepare your any questions or thoughts you may have had during the conversation. Question number 8 is the one where we use those 2 big letters, which have been strangely absent from our conversation, the letters A and I. What is the future of these semi-private digital spaces in the age of AI generation? Of course, we've seen blank in bio pop up in our commons under every single post nowadays. Bots abound on Twitter and Facebook. Yeah, this was something that Maggie spoke about in her essay, but wanted to get the opinions of the other writers on this shift in the age of AI generation, kind of starting with Leith.
Yeah, it's not a topic that I actually feel knowledgeable enough about. I'm still sort of like trying to understand like artificial intelligence in like a image production realm, which is something that is like closer to my practice and like where I sort of exist. So I don't think that I would have any sort of interesting or like relevant point to actually make about this. So I might pass the mic to someone else.
Josh, any thoughts on the matter?
I was participating in a reading group that's between myself and some other artist and an art critic. We had a relevant conversation to this that was around, I was asking the chat, I called them shrimp Jesus memes. Like it's like, you've probably seen it, but it's pictures of crabs and Jesus, and they look really bizarre. They do huge numbers on social media, and the caption says something like, I made this myself. You've probably seen it circulating. So I think probably the way I understand this is that there are clear, weird, novel things that thrive in ad-driven platforms. And so I imagine this kind of like the bathtub, that the water level is raising, that the internet is kind of filling up with spam and becoming more noisy, because those things look weird, they're attention grabbing, but they're, mostly meaningless. And, I think it's okay. It's okay for people to have bad taste as well. Like for some people, the For You pageification of the internet, that's what they prefer. They want 15-second snappy TikToks with cute fitness influencers and whatever. And, I think that's fine. But I also want an alternative where weird creative projects can exist. So preserving that possibility of doing stuff that isn't entirely 100% reliant on ad-driven metrics and whatever else. Those are the things that we have to try and protect. So yeah, I kind of see 2 trend lines here where as the internet becomes increasingly noisy, you scroll, people talk about engagement death spirals, which has been going on for a few years now, but in general, people are posting less. They're consuming more, but they're posting less. The internet more and more resembles cable TV already. And then what AI adds to that is even more advertisement, even more content, even more noise. So yeah, once you start to, again, looking at the underlying financial models for these things, once you start to put a tiny paywall, even if it was something like the cost of a stamp, for example, that's a huge disincentive to AI, that you'll get a lot less bots because it's just, so costly to join 1,000 different discords that all cost $1. Now the cost of running the bot is actually significantly something aside from its compute. So yeah, I kind of anticipate that there are various life cycles to dark forest spaces, but the AI trend line seems to point in one direction, where it increasingly outputs more and more complex, more and more novel content, and that only leads people to retreat into more, human-rich contextual spaces. Is kind of my guess for where that goes.
Harley and Julian, it occurs to me that the physics of the platforms affect the posts, which are the objects of the platforms. But namely, when we speak of virality, they mainly affect the human who wants to be driven by the gravity of virality. And bots don't care about likes potentially. So what's the relationship between the physics and these bots or AI entities on these platforms?
I mean, I first wanted to counter, but did you want to?
Cool. I mean, I would actually just say the entire telos of the bot is to maximize the likes. I think their entire existence will be oriented towards maximizing likes. I mean, that's the point of them. I think it's just going to be a spam flood of bots and an arms race to stop the spam flood of bots. But I see more people retreating into dark forest spaces, not less in the near future.
Yeah, but I mean, okay. Also, I see what Venkat just dropped in the chat. I mean, yes, AI is going to make the ClearNet spaces like worse in a lot of ways. However, it's something that Matt Dryhurst actually said, or Holly said, Holly Herndon, where we're at a time when your consumption is now productive. And I have to say, I found, thanks to like Julian's Spotify algorithm, which he's like been training for years now, like a lot of bands that I wish I knew about when I was like 18, that totally would have put on my radio show back then. And we're at a point where AI bots can also be, or, different AI can also be our friend. It can also, especially when applied in cozy web spaces where it can filter really efficiently. So, I mean, and I know personally, I use it increasingly to get more like facts and data and to filter data. So like, yes, it's going to make ClearNet like messier and worse on net, but there's also some really great applications of it, especially in the idea of, think about like all the people in your dark forest, cozy web network space, whatever, all like having really productive consumption, like all honing their playlists or whatever their behavior is so that their algorithms are really, really good. That could be amazing. So I don't know. I think there's some interesting applications.
I mean, AI 100% is going to enhance filtering. It's going to be like, I'm not taking some Manichean stance against AI and bots, period. I'm not that basic. Yeah, I mean, we're already thinking of ways of using AI to make the our community richer and to filter the internet, to learn from us, as you said, for our output like, to be productive.
Consumption is productive. There's also the idea that now, I mean, like obviously everyone talks about like how AI helps you code, but like it literally was going to help us potentially like build bots and like have more control over our spaces, because it's going to give a lot of people without a ton of tech knowledge like myself the tools to do that. So there's like a million applications. I mean, AI is just a hard word anyway, because it's like so broad and there are so many different applications.
But I will say already, if you told me 10 years ago that I would be mostly searching on Bing now, I would have told you you're fucking crazy. But yeah, like definitely searching with a bot is so much better.
Yeah.
So yeah.
This reminds me, I don't know if anybody saw the conversation between Tyler Cowen and Jonathan Haidt on Tyler's podcast, where, Tyler's response to the impact of social media on teenagers, that teens could just get a bot to synthesize all the information and get the plus value of social media without having the negative impacts. So that is, coming right up, and why don't they do that? So I think it's something that people have mentioned sort of broadly. But yeah, thank you so much for your answer. To end our last question. Yancey, in the post-individual essay, you mentioned this fragmentation of the self, which occurs in the digital realm. How does the protection of the dark forest allow us to reveal ourselves?
Great. Great full circle question, because I feel like it takes me back to like the messaverse. Because I like why these dark forests exist is I think because of our internal alts. Like I don't know if there's any dark forest space I'm in where I'm like my true fullest self exactly. It's always like, here's where I care about music. Here's where I talk to other people doing certain types of projects. Like here's another thing. So it's meeting specific verticals that are a part of who I am. But I think that when I talk about like how I think this is adding up to something, like I think that the internet is going to be the dominant mode of our social infrastructure, and that a world built on enlightenment-based ideals of what a person is something that is really going to be evolving based on what we now understand a person to be, which is more fractured, more multi-layered. In the post-individual, I talk about moving from one person, one vote to one identity per vote as sort of an implicit evolution we've been making. And so I think my assumption is just that this shit is real and is going to get more real, and that we are building a society based on ourselves befriending and cooperating and sparring and warring with each other. And that my hunch is that's like the next 1,000 years, hundreds of years, is built around some of these things we're starting to experience now. And so I view our experiences as, yes, sometimes mid or basic or cringe and like all kinds of things. I think they're also maybe universal, becoming more universal in the future. Maybe we're some of the first experiences of these feelings in this realm, but they'll become more normalized and understood. And yeah, I just, I don't admit defeat, but I sort of I see the changes as something that are larger than us or me. And I take a optimistic view to the future always. So I roll with it. I embrace it. I roll with it. I want to see how it's useful and see where we want to take it. But yeah, that's the bigger water that I think is moving on around us.
Thank you so much, Yancey. With that, we have a lot of wonderful people in the room. I'd like to open up the floor for any questions you may have for the authors of the anthology.
Maybe I'll ask
Michael.
one. People can, but one I wrote down before that Julian asked was about what do we do on Monday? Meaning, what do we do now? Like, okay, I agree with you. Well, what's supposed to happen now based on this? I felt like that was an interesting one to talk about.
The first step, perhaps we ask Venkat, given that there was some thoughts around the reclamation of the commons.
I think we just start to acquire new literacies. Like this has happened a couple of times in the last 20, 30 years, right? We had to learn to use species, then we had to learn to use the original Web 1, Web 2 came along, we had to learn to use it. Each time it's like it takes a year or two to acquire new media literacies essentially. And once it's there, it's like we were always that way. We forget what it was like to not have those literacies. So I think we are in that uncomfortable phase when we are a little too aware of the literacies we are acquiring. But I think we're actually in a good place. Like unconsciously, we are picking up the right literacies required to not just survive, but to like emerge again and reclaim. So I don't think you need to do anything specific on Monday. Kind of like just follow your intuitions. I think it's leading everybody in the right directions. I don't see this like spiraling into worse. I think we're past the bottom here.
Josh, I'm curious if you have any.
Yeah, I can contribute what I have to do for Monday, because this weekend I have to write a 3-year proposed financial budget for Do Not Research, because I'm going through the process of registering as a 501c3 entity in New York State. So my homework for this weekend is to lay out all of the different contributions, the expenses, and the spreadsheets for the next 3 years, which is, you know, a proposed model of running it. But I think maybe to just kind of tie this into some of the things that Venkat had brought up earlier is, you know, I really take this process of like building new legitimate institutions emerging from the dark forest as being the point of this, right? Because we've kind of established through the conversation that there's all sorts of, you know, terrible kind of entropic behaviors that can happen once you permanently wall yourself off from the world and things like that. So for me, I mean, I think there may be other solutions for this in the future. I'm kind of optimistic about some of the DAO tooling. I think that those things will emerge in the next 5 to 10 years. But I think practically speaking, it's not there yet. And the people who contribute to our community are just not familiar with these things. It would not be possible. And I don't want to wait for the tools to be built before I move over the organization. So in the meantime, what I'm doing is speccing out like how you would actually run this thing at a capacity that could bring on a few people to actually be dedicated to it, rather than existing as like a kind of part-time volunteer, you know, making it up as you go along type of organization. So yeah, doing 3 years at a time. Yeah, taking the process of institutionalization seriously. That's what I'll be doing for Monday.
Rebecca, you seem to have a lot of different actions that you've done. You mentioned that the equinox retreat. So any a specific action that you'll be taking on Monday?
After this conversation and after reading the text, you know, everything back to back and thinking about the synthesis of all our different ideas, I feel like we're in a place of play. I think everyone's talking about these new things emerging that I don't understand. And when new things emerge, the thing to do is play around with them, right? And to see what happens, to fuck about and find out. So I feel like we should be doing that and embracing that attitude, which is difficult, obviously, because the fear is always there, but it's also the only thing you can do in this sort of situation. And I think I would extend that to not just online activity, but what we do, you know, in our lives, like fuck around with your meditation practice, fuck around with your ritual practice, whatever you do that makes you feel something, whether it's online or offline, play with it and see whether you can make those two types of play synthesize and whether they maybe communicate with each other. I'm just starting to think of like, if I was going to put together a praxis for, you know, for people in the dark forest, which would obviously have nothing to do with the internet because I don't understand it, but it would have a lot to do with bodies and chanting and movement, that sort of thing. What would that look like? And how would that, is there a way to create a praxis that supports and facilitates the development of this new online world, but is still in the world that I understand? Those are the sort of ideas floating around in my head right now. Yeah. Or that I'm playing with, I guess.
Leith, you mentioned some research, some art projects that spoke directly to this issue. Any action that you'll take on Monday?
Speaking of legal entities, I guess there's like some form of effort of consolidation. I guess a big part of the sort of like dark forest history, or at least the dark forest that we've been speaking about, has been like generating, like creating. And I think there's like a lot of effort are being put now into like consolidating those things and actually making them real. And I guess in parallel to Do Not Research, Trust is also like working towards like becoming like a legal entity in Berlin as well. So I guess it would be interesting to see how the sort of like, yeah, institutions develop over the next few years.
Amazing. Peter.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer what I'm going to do Monday. I liked Venkat's follow your intuition, I think, which is what we're all doing. No one really has an answer of what should happen. But there's one thing that I found interesting about this conversation is that the word community hasn't shown up much. And I hate that word, by the way. I think it's over like abused and used too much, online communities. But and I'm less interested in kind of community, more interested in what they call communitas, kind of cultivating sort of sacred spaces where a sense of oneness emerges in a social field without people like collapsing into groupthink. And I think that's possible to achieve. People in integral theorists call it the we space. And so I'm interested both in dark forests and online to kind of create that social environment so more communitas energy emerges rather than just a community.
And Little Internet and Carly actively, I think, engaged in the practice of I'll say the word community making, but any actions for Monday?
I mean, to be honest, we're in the coziest web right now we have a 9-month-old baby, so that's kind of our focus is extremely local at the moment.
Yeah, just devirtualize on Monday. I mean, just like take it, like meet the people that are in your cozy web spaces.
Yeah, but I mean, for new models in general, we do have events. We have met each other. We do try to do things like this, and we have lots of ideas for, continuing to really flow with the tide of media in general, especially one that's that watches back.
I mean, I think it's also one of our tenets was like we reserve the right to change. And I just think like continuously just allowing yourself to reformulate, because media is continuously reformulating and not being too dogmatic about like the shape that your community takes. But devirtualizing, and also like the book, I think it's so great that this book was printed, because that's how we archive the web. That's how we archive scroll space, right? So like devirtualize, print something out on Monday and put it on your shelf that you really care about. Make it real.
We have a question from Lore.
Yeah. So I'll reveal that I am a fan of cozy web / dark forest spaces. And what I've learned from research and talking to folks and just thinking about it myself is that part of what is so appealing about the social media, like public landscape, is the finding of one another. And if we're in these dark forests, then it seems like there's still a question of like, how do I find these magical people if I'm not already in this context without that social media layer? And it doesn't feel like it's an impossible problem, but I'm curious about the folks on the panel's instincts about where that will go.
That speaks to kind of this tension, and I think a lot of the personal anxiety I feel is that you gotta stick your head up out of the parapet, like to be seen. Like, who are the people that I know what they think they're people who take the time to share their ideas, and so I've found them in some way. But it's like without that step, there's no way. So there's a little bit of, I mean, that's kind of what Eugene's piece is about, and all the things of like the blog post is the most powerful thing on the web because it brings people to you. But like, there is a little bit of that's important. That I think defines how I've came across everyone else on this stage at one point or another, which is reading something they had made. Does anyone have another idea for that?
Yeah, I can go. I try to like really like what's the spirit of the thing that's being created and putting on the Web2 or the spectacle, and the platforms that I use that are like non-doc forest or Substack and YouTube sometimes. And when I put like an artifact out there, I really try to just make it art, not necessarily it's good art, but I just want to like create something and put it out there. I'm not trying to play the attention economy game, so I try not to like operate from that space at all. And my working theory is that sort of like, if people resonate with that, they sense the authenticity that I'm putting behind that, that's sort of like bait away from the spectacle into these more dark forest spaces.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question from L. Fiorentino. Do you have any predictions for how short-form video will affect the evolution of online communities? I think we can even broaden it into just shifts in media in general. And of course, you got to go back to the great metaphor of the physics of each of these different forms of media.
I could share one note. I mean, I don't know if it's about as much of short form video itself as the physics of TikTok and the video on that particular platform. I mean, I kind of love it. There's Zoomers sort of helming revival movements of every single possible subculture that's ever existed. There's like a Zoomer shoegaze revival, a Zoomer nu metal revival, a Zoomer 2008 jump style revival. Like I haven't seen a Zoomer tectonic revival yet. I don't even know if anyone remembers that, but yeah, but I mean, and it's also caused this shift, I think, in the West of a more kind of Eastern way of engaging with subcultures, where it's kind of a sincere LARP instead of a Gen X-y idea of authenticity. Um, and on the surface, though, I think they actually are really, there's a lot of talent, first of all, and they're really making a lot of effort in getting the codes right and innovating and sort of iterating a little bit outwards with something a little bit newer with them. And I don't know if these things actually devirtualize in any local space, but in terms of just subcultures, like music-based subcultures, I think it's actually been great. So I kind of yeah, it doesn't, I mean, it's not really affecting our community in any way, but I dare say like TikTok, I think, has been good for the culture of young people.
I could maybe, if I can jump in on this topic, Ruby, because
Yeah.
I produce a very little bit of short form video and then also long form, contextually rich conversation. And I did within a few weeks of each other, there's two examples here. So I produced a video where I spoke at FWB Fest in 2023, and this thing runs for about 45 minutes, explaining several years of research, lots of different diagrams, historical citations, really kind of in the weeds, high resolution, nitty gritty. And that capped out around like 10,000 views, which is, what I kind of assume my audience is that there's other people who catch it, it might come across their feed or whatever, but I'm kind of publishing to a core audience of like 10,000 people. A fraction of that is monetized and gives donations to support the work. A few months apart from that, I produced a short form video that was, I think, 54 seconds or something like that, a minute long reel basically on Instagram, which was from my collaboration with Jacob Hurwitz Goodman, who's a filmmaker and documentarian based in LA. And that short form video got 1 million views. So we have here, two orders of magnitude, 100x between these two different formats. And I had them, a few weeks apart. And I was able to really analyze in a meaningful way what type of people that brought in, what type of conversations that had, what the audience impact was. And, it probably won't surprise you, but the people who sat through the 45-minute lecture, I had some very detailed quality conversations with them, and they really cared about the work. The people who watched the viral TikTok reel, basically the Instagram reel, it is just the most like ruthless, I mean, like personal attacks, just people from all over different walks of life. People are discussing, they're talking about neoliberalism, they're talking about libertarianism. There's people from all over the spectrum. It's just actual like chaos. And I was, to be totally honest, transfixed by this downward spiral of just chaos in the common threads that at some point became self-perpetuating, such that there was so much controversy, so much, engagement across the board, that it propelled it to even bigger audience. So yeah, the tags, the DMs, the comments I got from that, 100x bigger audience, much less context, much less information, was a lot more meaningless and annoying and frustrating. And then the people who watched the 45-minute lecture, great conversations. Some of them joined the community. Hey, I found this through this video. Very cool stuff. Talked about it on podcasts and so on. So there may be at some point divergent types of internet use, where there's an audience that prefers cable television, and then there's an audience that prefers like prestige TV, like HBO, Sopranos type stuff. And yeah, I will happily be in the HBO type channel. I'll pay a little bit more for it, but I'll be enriched by the things I receive in return.
Caroline, Julian, Josh, Peter, Venkat, Rebecca, and Leith, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. All of you in the room, you're officially part of the Dark Forest Collective. We are very, very happy to have you in our presence today. It is now 5 o'clock EST, and it is the soft closing of this first ever Dark Forest Collective meeting. Thank you very much. Oh, and Yancey, and Yancey, of course. Thank you.
Thank you all. This was so fun. So fun. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for hanging out. What a great time. Everybody, you were so great. You're so great.
And thank you, Ruby. That was fantastic moderation. What stamina.
Thank you.
All right. I know we don't really want it to end, but I'm going to save us. Go do other things. We love you all. Appreciate you. See you soon. See you soon.
Cheers.